I never told my grandson's fiance's family that I spent 28 years as a federal air marshal chasing men who thought altitude made them untouchable. To them, I was just a tired old widower who fixed lawnmowers in his garage and forgot where he left his glasses. They threatened to take my grandson's business, his home, and his good name. He almost let them. And when the man behind it all finally showed up at my door expecting to find a feeble old fool, well, let's just say I'd been waiting for him a lot longer than he knew. Before I get into it, tell me where you're tuning in from tonight, and if you believe family is worth protecting no matter your age, hit that subscribe button. It was a Tuesday evening in October when my phone rang. I was in the garage, elbow deep in a neighbor's snowblower, and I almost let it go to voicemail. But something told me to wipe my hands and answer. It was my grandson, Caleb. "Grandpa," he said, and I could hear it right away, that thin, cracked sound in his voice that told me he'd been crying and trying to hide it. "Can I come by? I need to talk to you." I didn't ask questions. When family calls like that, you don't ask questions, you just say yes and you put the coffee on. Caleb showed up 20 minutes later looking like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. He's 29, runs a small custom furniture business out of a workshop his grandmother and I helped him start 7 years ago. Good kid, works with his hands, doesn't waste money, treats people right. He'd gotten engaged that spring to a young woman named Priya, and by all accounts, she seemed lovely. I'd met her twice. Polite, quiet, always looked a little nervous, which I chalked up to meeting the future in-laws. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that Priya's stepfather, a man named Douglas Kane, had been circling my grandson's business for months, like a buzzard waiting for something to die. Caleb sat at my kitchen table and told me everything. Douglas ran what he called a family investment firm, which was really just him convincing desperate people to sign over partial ownership of their companies in exchange for quick cash, then slowly squeezing them out entirely through fine print and manufactured debt. He'd approached Caleb 3 months earlier, all smiles and firm handshakes, offering to help him expand his workshop into a second location. Caleb, trusting, in love, wanting to build a good life for his future wife, signed papers he didn't fully understand. "He's saying I owe him $90,000, Grandpa," Caleb said. His hands wrapped so tight around his coffee mug, his knuckles had gone white. "He says if I don't pay by the end of the month, he's taking the workshop. The building, the tools, everything. And he told Priya that if she doesn't convince me to just hand it over quietly, he'll make sure her mother loses her job. He has that kind of reach." Grandpa, I think I ruined everything. I sat there and listened to my grandson's voice shake, and something old and quiet woke up inside me. Something I'd buried a long time ago in a box in the back of my closet, right next to a badge I hadn't touched in 11 years. "You didn't ruin anything," I told him, and I meant it. "Tell me his full name. Tell me everything you remember about these papers." Caleb looked at me like I'd lost my mind. To him, I was just his grandfather, the man who taught him to whittle and took him fishing and once, memorably, fell asleep at his own retirement party. He had no idea that for nearly 3 decades, my job had been sitting 3 rows behind dangerous men on airplanes, watching their hands, learning to read a liar's face before he even opened his mouth. He had no idea I'd spent half my career working joint task forces with the FBI on exactly the kind of financial predators who now had his name in their teeth. "Get some sleep here tonight," I told him. "Let me make a phone call in the morning." That night, after Caleb finally drifted off on the couch, I walked out to the garage, past the snowblower, past the lawnmowers, to a locked metal cabinet in the corner that my late wife, Margaret, used to call Grandpa's boring paperwork box. She knew. She always knew. She just let me keep my old life folded up small so it wouldn't frighten anyone. I opened it and found my badge sitting where I'd left it, dull under a thin layer of dust. Federal Air Marshal Service. 28 years. I picked it up, felt the familiar weight settle into my palm, and for the first time in over a decade, I felt something other than tired. The next morning, I drove out to Caleb's workshop under the pretense of dropping off some old chisels that used to belong to his grandfather's father. Douglas Kane was already there, standing in the doorway in an overcoat that probably cost more than my truck, flanked by a younger man carrying a leather folder full of documents. Douglas was maybe 55, silver-haired, with the kind of practiced warmth that men use when they're about to take something from you and want you to thank them for it. He looked at me, this stooped old man in a flannel jacket carrying a toolbox, and I watched his eyes slide right past me like I was part of the furniture. That's the thing about being 71 years old in a room full of people who think power belongs to the young and the loud. You become invisible. And invisible, in my former line of work, was the most useful thing a man could be. "You must be the grandfather," Douglas said, extending a hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Douglas Kane. I'm just here helping Caleb sort out some financial arrangements." "Financial arrangements," I repeated slowly, letting my voice come out thin and a little confused, the way an old man's voice does when he's trying to keep up with things he doesn't understand. "Is that what we're calling it?" Douglas's smile flickered, just for a second, like he wasn't used to being questioned by furniture. "It's complicated business, sir. Nothing you need to worry yourself with." I nodded slowly, shuffled past him into the workshop, set my toolbox down, and let him believe exactly what he wanted to believe. That I was nobody. That I was harmless. That I was exactly what I looked like. He had no idea what he'd just told an invisible old man to not worry himself with. Over the next 2 days, I did what I used to do best. I listened. I watched. I asked Caleb for copies of every document he'd signed, every email, every text message from Douglas, and from Priya's mother, a nervous, kind woman named Renata, who I could tell was every bit as trapped as her daughter. I sat at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on, the same table where Margaret used to do the crossword, and I went through Douglas Kane's contract line by line the way I used to go through a suspect's travel itinerary, looking for the seam, looking for the lie. And I found it fast, because men like Douglas Kane are rarely as careful as they think they are. The contract Caleb signed wasn't a loan agreement at all. It was structured as a majority ownership transfer disguised in language dense enough to make an honest young man's eyes glaze over before he got to the part that mattered. Douglas hadn't lent Caleb $90,000. He'd maneuvered him into signing away 60% of a business worth nearly $500,000 for a fraction of its value, with a default clause designed to trigger no matter what Caleb did. This wasn't Douglas's first workshop. It wasn't his first young couple, either. That evening, Caleb called me in a panic. Priya had come to him crying. Douglas had told her mother that if the two of them didn't sign the workshop over quietly by Friday, he'd make sure Renata was fired from her job at the hospital, where she worked as a billing administrator, a job Douglas apparently had leverage over through a hospital board member who owed him money. Priya begged Caleb to just give in, to let it go, to protect her mother. "I don't know what to do, Grandpa," Caleb said. "I love her. I don't want her mom to lose everything because of me." "You're not going to lose the workshop," I told him, and for the first time, there was steel in my voice that Caleb had never heard from me before. "And nobody's mother is losing her job. Give me until Friday." "Grandpa, what are you going to do? You're 71. You fix lawnmowers." I let out a small laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere old and tired but not defeated. "Let an old man surprise you for once, son." That night, I opened the box in my garage cabinet all the way. Beneath the badge was a small black case I hadn't opened since my last day on the job. Inside it, a burner-style secure phone, government-issued encryption still technically active because old habits and old friends die slow. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 11 years. It rang twice. "This better be an emergency, old man," said the gravelly voice on the other end. "Dennis Whitfield, my old supervisor, now a deputy director working financial crimes task forces out of the regional FBI field office. We'd flown together, chased the same ghosts through the same airports for 2 decades. He owed me his career, and honestly, once, his life, back when a man tried to open a cockpit door over Ohio, and I put him on the floor before he got the handle turned." "It is an emergency, Dennis," I said, "but not the kind that needs a plane. I need everything you've got on a man named Douglas Kane." There was a pause, then the sound of a keyboard clicking. Kane, give me a second." "Jesus, Walt, you know how to pick 'em. We've had a file open on this guy for 2 years. Predatory lending disguised as investment partnerships, mostly targeting small family businesses and immigrant-owned shops. He's careful, though. Nobody's ever willing to testify. He always finds their weak spot before he moves in." "He found my grandsons," I said quietly. The line went silent for a long moment. "Give me 48 hours, Dennis finally said. "And Walt, if you're thinking about handling this the old way, I need you to remember you're retired." "I'm not planning on doing anything illegal, Dennis," I said. And I meant it, mostly. "I'm planning on doing something educational." The next 2 days, I lived a quiet double life inside my own family. To Caleb, to Priya, to my own son and daughter-in-law who came by worried sick, I was still just Grandpa Walt, shuffling around with his coffee and his bad knees, offering platitudes and pie. But underneath that flannel jacket, I was cataloging every piece of leverage I had. Dennis called back on day 2 with a file that confirmed everything I suspected and more. Douglas Kane had run this exact scheme on at least 6 other small businesses across 3 states, always through a maze of shell entities registered under his late wife's family trust to keep his own name clean. 2 of his previous victims had lost everything. 1 had lost his marriage. Nobody had ever pressed charges because Douglas was patient, and predators who are patient rarely get caught. But patient men make one mistake eventually. They get comfortable. And Douglas Kane, after 3 months of watching an old man in a flannel jacket smile and nod and fetch coffee, had gotten very comfortable indeed. Friday morning arrived cold and gray. Douglas showed up at the workshop at 10 sharp, this time with 2 men I didn't recognize, broader than the assistant from before, the kind of men who don't carry briefcases because their job isn't paperwork. Renata was there too, ushered along by Douglas like a prop, her eyes red-rimmed, refusing to look at her daughter. Priya stood beside Caleb, gripping his hand so hard her knuckles had gone pale, and I stood a few feet back by the workbench, an old man fidgeting with a stack of unsigned papers. Caleb had asked me to hold, my reading glasses perched on the end of my nose. "I trust we're all here to be reasonable today," Douglas said, setting his leather folder on the workbench with a soft, confident thud. "Caleb, sign the transfer, and this all goes away quietly. Nobody gets hurt. Renata keeps her job. Everyone walks away with their dignity intact." Caleb's hand trembled over the pen. I watched Priya squeeze his fingers, torn between saving her mother and losing the man she loved. This was the moment. Every predator has a moment where they believe they've already won, where the arrogance blinds them to what's standing 3 feet away in a flannel jacket holding a stack of papers. "Before anybody signs anything," I said, my voice suddenly not thin, not confused, not an old man's voice at all, "I think you should take a look at what's actually in this folder you brought, Douglas." The room went still. Douglas turned to look at me the way you'd look at a piece of furniture that had just started talking. "Excuse me?" I set down the stack of papers I'd been holding and reached instead into the inner pocket of my flannel jacket, pulling out a thin folder of my own. "You've been running this exact place since 2019. Meridian Fine Crafts in Ohio. Petrov Family Bakery outside Pittsburgh. The Alvarez Cabinetry Shop in Erie, which, by the way, you drove into bankruptcy and then bought the equipment at auction through a shell company registered to your late wife's family trust. Rosewood Holdings, isn't it? Or was it Kane Whitmore Partners that time?" Douglas's face went the color of old paper. "I don't know what you think I think I'm an old man who spent 28 years learning exactly how liars breathe when they're cornered, Douglas," I said, straightening up, letting the stoop fall out of my shoulders for the first time in 3 months. "Federal Air Marshal Service. 28 years. And in all that time, I learned that the most dangerous men in any room are rarely the ones raising their voice." I watched it land. Watched the recognition creep in, the terrible arithmetic of realizing the harmless old man fetching coffee had spent 3 days quietly dismantling him. "You're bluffing," Douglas said, but his voice had lost its silk. "Renata," I said gently, turning to Priya's mother, who was staring at me like I'd descended from the sky. "Nobody at that hospital is losing their job today. The board member Douglas has been leaning on to threaten your position. A man named Corey Blakeston is currently the subject of a federal ethics inquiry that opened this morning, largely thanks to some financial records. A friend of mine at the Bureau found very interesting. I'd imagine Mr. Blakeston has bigger problems than your billing department by lunchtime." Renata's hand flew to her mouth. Priya turned to stare at Douglas, betrayal and fury rising fast behind the fear. Douglas's 2 silent men shifted their weight, glancing at each other, glancing at their boss, waiting for a signal that wasn't coming, because Douglas Kane had absolutely no idea what to do with a 71-year-old man who suddenly wasn't afraid of him. "This isn't over," Douglas said, snatching his folder off the workbench, his hands not quite steady. "That contract is legally binding. I will see this workshop in my portfolio by the end of the month, old man. Whether you like it or not." "I don't think you will," I said calmly. "Because I glanced at my watch, an old habit from 100 stakeouts, timing things down to the second, about 4 minutes. Some friends of mine are going to walk through that door with a warrant to seize every document, laptop, and hard drive in this building relating to Rosewood Holdings and every alias you've hidden behind since 2019. Douglas laughed, sharp and disbelieving, though it cracked at the edges. You expect me to believe some retired old fool has the FBI on speed dial? Right on cue, tires crunched on gravel outside. Doors opened, Douglas's face drained of every trace of color, as three federal agents in windbreakers walked through the workshop door, led by a broad-shouldered man with silver at his temples, who I hadn't seen in person in over a decade. Douglas Kane, Dennis Whitfield said, holding up his badge. We need to have a conversation about Rosewood Holdings, Kane Whitmore Partners, and about 6 other names you've been hiding behind. Douglas's 2 men bolted for the door and were stopped cold by 2 more agents waiting outside. There was no chase, no struggle, no drama, just the quiet, inevitable sound of a predator's world collapsing in real time, the same sound I'd heard 100 times before in airport terminals and hotel lobbies, the sound of a man realizing far too late that he had misjudged exactly who he was dealing with. Dennis walked over to me, and for a second the whole workshop went quiet as he clasped my hand. Damn good to see you again, Walt, even under these circumstances. Good to be useful again, Dennis, I said. And I meant it more than I expected to. Caleb stood frozen by the workbench, staring at me like he'd never seen me before in his life, which, in a way, he hadn't. Priya had both hands pressed over her mouth. Renata was sobbing quietly with relief into her daughter's shoulder. Grandpa, Caleb finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. What? Who are you? I walked over to him, put a hand on his shoulder, the same shoulder I used to steady when he was learning to ride his first bicycle. I'm still your grandfather, son. I always will be. I just used to be somebody else too, a long time ago, before your father was even born. Your grandmother knew. It never scared her. I hope it doesn't scare you. Caleb pulled me into a hug so tight it nearly knocked the wind out of me. And over his shoulder, I watched the federal agents lead Douglas Kane out in handcuffs, his expensive overcoat looking a lot less impressive with his hands, zip-tied behind his back, and his silver hair falling loose across his forehead. Douglas paused in the doorway, twisting back to look at me one last time, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief. Who are you? Really? I didn't raise my voice. I never had to. I'm just an old man who fixes lawnmowers, Douglas. But you should have asked yourself why a lawnmower repairman keeps a locked cabinet in his garage. They led him away. Renata's job was safe within the hour, once word of the ethics inquiry reached the hospital board. The seized documents from Douglas's laptop confirmed everything and then some. 7 businesses across 4 states, nearly $2 million extracted through fear and fine print, and enough evidence to guarantee Douglas Kane wouldn't be threatening any more young couples for a very long time. He eventually pleaded guilty to wire fraud and extortion rather than risk a trial with federal prosecutors holding a decade of paper trail against him. Last I heard, he's serving a sentence that will keep him behind bars well into his 70s, which felt like a fitting kind of justice for a man who preyed on people's futures. Caleb's workshop is thriving now. He and Priya were married that following spring, in my backyard, under the same oak tree where I taught him to whittle as a boy. Renata walked her daughter down a little garden path we built special for the occasion, and I stood up during the toast and told the room, quite honestly, that I had never been prouder of anyone than I was of my grandson, for having the courage to ask an old man for help instead of trying to carry the weight alone. I still keep that badge in the garage cabinet, right next to the chisels that belonged to my father. I don't imagine I'll ever need to use what's left of those old instincts again, but I've learned something in the year since it all happened. Retirement doesn't retire the parts of you that matter most. It doesn't retire a father's instinct or a grandfather's. And it certainly doesn't retire nearly 3 decades spent learning exactly how dangerous men behave when they think nobody's watching. If you're out there thinking your quiet life has made you soft, invisible, unimportant, let me tell you something Margaret used to say to me every single night before she passed. The quietest man in the room is usually the one who's already won. Douglas Kane learned that lesson the hard way. In a workshop full of sawdust, surrounded by federal agents he never saw coming, brought down by an old man he mistook for furniture. If this story reminded you that family is always worth protecting, no matter your age, no matter how tired you feel some mornings, hit subscribe, tell me where you're watching from tonight, and let me know in the comments whether you've ever underestimated somebody you shouldn't have.